Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Gruniger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Gruniger. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'd like to begin by thanking the sponsor of today's podcast, the Gloucester History Festival. The Gloucester History Festival invites you to join 100 of Britain's top historians, actors, comedians and broadcasters in a mouth-watering programme of events this September. The 50 Blackfriars talks take place in the magical setting of Blackfriars Priory and will be live-streamed for you to enjoy wherever you are in the world. Watch in person or online to hear from Philippa Gregory, Alison Weir, Nathan Armin, Linda Porter, David Olusoga, Dan Jones, Greg Jenner, William Dalrymple, Yanina Ramirez, Kate Williams and more world-class speakers who'll be sharing their love of history in Gloucester. Livestream event tickets give you access to your events until the 27th of September. Book now at gloucesterhistoryfestival.co.uk. The festival runs from the 7th to the 22nd of September. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the generous listeners who continue to support Talking Tudors on Patreon, and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. As an independent podcaster, this means the world to me. If you love the podcast, please consider joining the Talking Tudors Patreon family. Visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. Once you sign up, you'll have access to exclusive posts, additional monthly live talks, a member-only book club, patron-only monthly giveaways, to name just a few of the rewards. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled to welcome Brett Dolman to the podcast to talk about a new exhibition that's recently opened at Hampton Court, the Tudor World in the Wolsey Rooms. Brett Dolman is a curator and historian specialising in the creation, purpose and reception of Western European art in the 16th to early 18th centuries. As curator collections based at Hampton Court, he's responsible for the management, research, display and interpretation of fine art, including paintings and tapestries. He works alongside colleagues at Royal Collection Trust and has a research interest in the display of Royal Collection paintings at Hampton Court from the 16th century to the present. At historic royal palaces since 2003, Brett has curated exhibitions and displays on Tudor and Stuart history, Shakespeare and court drama, court portraiture and the Royal Collection. At Hampton Court, he's the curator of the Cumberland Art Gallery and the Mantegna Gallery. He has published on portraiture, Tudor history, painting, Baroque murals, the Royal Collection and the Raphael cartoons. Let's dive straight into our conversation. Welcome to Talking Tudors, Brett. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. It's very sunny here, which is unusual for the unpredictable and elusive English summer, but it's very nice.
Yes, it does look nice and sunny where you are. So we are here to talk about something quite exciting, and that is a new display that's on at Hampton Court Palace, one of my favourite places in the world, the Tudor World in the Wolsey Rooms. But before we dive into that, it would be wonderful if you could just introduce yourself to our listeners and just tell us a little bit about you and your background.
I'm Brett Dolman. I am a curator collections for Historic Royal Palaces. Historic Royal Palaces are a charity that look after Hampton Court, the Tower of London, Kensington Palace, Kew, the Banqueting House in Whitehall and Hillsborough Castle in Northern Ireland. And as a curator, I'm part of a team that looks after the historic collections at our palaces, our own and also those of the Royal Collection, which still decorate our walls and fill our galleries. So for me, that means paintings, tapestries, sculpture, and everyday objects too, across the palaces, across different periods of history. So there's almost 1,000 years of history attached to our palaces. So that's quite a challenge. But I'm really a 16th and 17th century historian and art historian. So as you say, I'm going to talk today about something that's more familiar to me than some of the subjects we have to cover, which is our new permanent exhibition at Hampton Court Palace, the Tudor World in the Wolsey Rooms.
How wonderful. Well, let's begin by you just introducing us to this new exhibition and maybe telling us a little bit about the themes that you explore there.
Yeah, well, firstly, our new galleries will be a permanent home for some of the most important surviving artworks in the royal collection from the reign of Henry VIII, most especially three rare history paintings which depict the king's 1513 military campaign in France, the Battle of the Spurs, and the spectacular festival and sporting tournament of 1520, the Field of Cloth of Gold. But these are paintings that don't just tell a royal story, they are also full of people. Soldiers, courtiers, servants, cooks, musicians, sailors, gunners, men and women, children. They are a wonderful gateway, in other words, into the lives of some of the ordinary men and women who lived and worked at Hampton Court and enabled the Tudor court to exist and to flourish. So our displays are more than just a Tudor gallery. They are an exploration of the wider world of the 1500s. So we go beyond our familiar Hampton Court story of Henry VIII and his 6 queens and explore what their Tudor world really looked like, who worked for the Tudor court, how did the Tudor dynasty provide new opportunities, new ideas, new encounters? Or to put it another way, what contact did the Tudors have with the rest of the world? How did it feel to work for this most ambitious and unpredictable royal regime? How did England change in the 1500s? How did people navigate what was both a century of opportunity, but also of division, persecution and challenge? So we really hope that our new exhibition will give everyone a sense of what the whole world looked like across the whole of the 1500s. And for this perhaps to be a start of a new dialogue about the Tudors, where we ask fresh questions about the early modern era.
We are going to explore some of those things that you've just spoken about in a little bit more detail. But before we do that, I want to talk to you about the actual physical space in which the exhibition is taking place or happening. So when were these rooms actually built and who were they built for?
The Wolsey Rooms were built in the 1520s, and our other ambition really has been simply to reopen the Wolsey Rooms to the public for the first time since 2019. And we did have a temporary exhibition over the summer of 2021 in these rooms, but we've now spent the last couple of years refurbishing and resurfacing them so that they can better protect and display the artworks and historic objects in our care. Because the Wolsey Rooms themselves are really important. They're some of the earliest surviving interiors at Hampton Court, and their artworks in themselves. Originally built for Thomas Wolsey, who I'm sure everyone listening will know was Henry VIII's right-hand man through the early part of his reign, his chief minister, his friend, an enormously powerful statesman and cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church, and the owner of Hampton Court in the 1520s, when this place was transformed from a relatively modest manor house into a palace. Now, not much of Wolsey's original residence is left. Henry VIII took over Hampton Court and rebuilt it, expanded it further into a great royal palace. And much of Henry's palace was also demolished by the later building programs and modernization programs of later monarchs. But we do have a set of rooms, Wolsey's private apartment, in this rather secret corner of the palace, which still survive. And the Wolsey Rooms are evocative Tudor spaces. Most of the rich furnishings and furniture have long disappeared, but we still have the colourful decorative ceilings and the stone fireplaces and fragments of what would have been these magnificent Renaissance interiors that would have truly sparkled under Tudor candlelight and would have made Hampton Court one of the most splendid, most modern buildings in the country.
And I love to learn about the function of these rooms. So can you talk to us a little bit about how these rooms were used? And also, I love walking in the footsteps of the Tudors. So who are we walking in the footsteps of in these rooms?
Right. Well, Wolsey needed a house that would impress his important European guests and have enough room for grand entertainments, guest bedrooms for the royal family, even a chapel. He built Henry VIII, Catherine of Aragon and their daughter Princess Mary their own royal lodgings here years before Hampton Court became a royal palace. But the Wolsey Rooms that survive are Wolsey's own apartment, which once extended over 3 floors across the riverside of his new palace. 6 rooms remain, and I really think you can imagine him still here, looking out over the garden towards the River Thames, awaiting the arrival of the French ambassador, perhaps, or an envoy from the Pope. This is where some of the big conversations happened in the 1520s. This is, to put it another way, where the Tudors met the rest of the world. Later, after Wolsey had failed to get Henry a divorce and he'd been forced to relinquish his power and his home, in fact, to the king, these rooms were refurbished for the use of Princess Mary, and later, we believe, for Henry's last queen, Catherine Parr. Elizabeth I made some alterations too, which suggests they were kept luxuriously furnished for her use. And in the 17th century, they became an apartment for the Master of the Horse, one of the most important royal household officials. And later still, they were used by a succession of grace and favour residents of the palace after the royal family had stopped using Hampton Court in the mid-18th century. Beyond that, unfortunately, we know very little about how each of the surviving spaces were used or furnished. There are 2 large rooms, probably for entertaining or for larger meetings, 2 very intimate closets, and 2 sort of in-between spaces. Somehow, somewhere, Wolsey must have had a bedchamber and a study. We know he had a long gallery, demolished centuries ago, which would have been used for promenading and exercising when it was wet outside, or perhaps for gaming and dancing even for business. Imagine Wolsey having lengthy chats with French diplomats before both countries declared war on the Holy Roman Empire in 1528. So the fact that so much is missing or unknown is one of the reasons that we've decided not to attempt to recreate Wolsey's palace here, as the evidence is so limited, but to fill the rooms instead with stories and Tudor artworks that will hopefully both transport our visitors back to the 16th century, but also allow them to explore the Tudor world in more detail than a literal room recreation project would enable.
And let's talk more about some of those objects that visitors can actually see in this area of the palace, and also what insights they offer into the world of the Tudor monarchs.
So as well as the Tudor history paintings, which I mentioned at the beginning, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a bit, there are a range of historic artworks and objects relating to Wolsey's lost palace, as well as to the wider themes of the 16th century, this challenging era of globalization, of new encounters, shared knowledge, but also new political and religious divisions. We have some key loans from other collections, such as Stonyhurst College in Lancashire, including Thomas More's crucifix reliquary and official seal, and the travelling chest of a Jesuit priest full of illegal religious contraband. And we'll also have Thomas Wolsey's, or we also already have because we're open, we also have Thomas Wolsey's portable sundial and a gold ring associated with the family of Anne Boleyn. And we'll have a small collection of portraits from the royal collection of some of the key rulers of the 1500s, of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, Francis I of France, and of Henry VIII himself. And these portraits, I think, particularly reveal the way kings like to be portrayed, the values associated with kingship then. So in the portrait of Henry VIII, we have, which was painted by Joos van Clever in about 1530, the artist has taken great pains to show the king in the most magnificent of fabrics, silk, fur, and cloth of gold, and an abundance of jewellery to advertise his status and style. Now, this not only served to convey Henry's personal authority and wealth, but also, by extension, the reputation of the Tudor court. Henry's also holding a scroll in this portrait, on which there's an inscription taken from the Christian New Testament, which says, "Go thee into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature." Now, this signifies Henry's Christian faith and his responsibilities. This missionary obligation to spread Christianity to the rest of the world became the justification for colonisation and empire building for European nations. And in this same room, in our exhibition, facing off against the kings, we have 3 portraits of queens. 2 ought to be very familiar, Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, painted in very similar ways, both wearing a formal court dress decorated with gold embroidery, with jewelled headdresses and pearl necklaces. And it's the similarities actually in these portraits which are, I think, key. This is something that your previous podcaster Charlotte Bolland talked about for the National Portrait Gallery exhibition, because both of these paintings, these particular paintings, were painted probably as part of a set later in the 1500s, after the death of both women. So what's telling about them is, while they look quite similar, the differences are also key as to how both women's images were remembered at the time and how we still see them today. The portrait of Catherine is arguably, I think, more modest. Covering her hair, she's wearing this complicated, richly decorated gable or English hood, and the whole headdress creating this sort of arched geometric shape held in place by a wire support that would have been there to frame her face. And the neckline of her dress reveals this white smock beneath, decorated with black work, which is a style of abstract embroidery believed to have its origins in the geometric Moorish designs found in Spain, Catherine's homeland. Anne Boleyn, on the other hand, has the so-called French hood that curves in a more elegant semicircle around her head, revealing some of her dark reddish-brown hair. Her smock is also cut much lower, so that there's only naked flesh above the neckline of her dress. And around her neck, Anne wears one of the most famous pieces of jewellery associated with her, the bee pendant, her trademark, really. So, of course, these portraits also remind us that this was an age where women, even queens, were dependent and subservient to their husbands. And ultimately, in the case of Catherine and Anne, lost all their power, their lives, to the tyrannical dynastic ambition of Henry VIII. And the third portrait here is of another queen, like Catherine and Anne, richly dressed and crowned with an elaborate golden bejeweled headdress and identified through a painted inscription at the top, Rossa, consort of Suleiman, emperor of the Turks. But Rossa was no princess or aristocratic court lady destined for queenship. She was an ordinary European girl captured by raiding Crimean Tartars and sold into slavery at the Ottoman court. But she defied the odds, attracting the devotion of the Emperor Suleiman, acquiring the name Hurrem, the joyful one, became the emperor's legal wife, breaking with tradition, and became an influential force in Ottoman politics. So even in an age of legalized sexism, when women were regarded as inferior, physically, intellectually, morally, some exceptional women battled to achieve their potential. And not just queens, but musicians and artists, and lower down the scale, admittedly often only as widows, managers of family businesses. And whilst Catherine and Anne's fates were ultimately dependent on Henry, while they reigned, they set examples for their daughters, who would become the first reigning queens of England, Mary I and Elizabeth I. So we try to trace some of those themes through the exhibition and draw that out through some of the portraits and artworks that we have on display.
Oh, I cannot wait to see those paintings. So while I'd love to talk more about these formidable women, I am going to turn to Henry VIII for a moment. So you talked earlier about some rare paintings that you have on display. So what do they tell us about Henry's aspirations and his achievements as well?
Well, the Tudor history paintings, which are really the centerpiece of the display. In the final room, we have a room dominated by two of them, these enormous paintings that represent the embarkation at Dover and the Field of Cloth of Gold, which both commemorate the journey to and the event of Henry VIII's first meeting with Francis I, King of France, at this massively expensive and extravagant festival and sporting tournament held near Calais in 1520. And the first painting, The Embarkation, shows a busy seascape outside Dover Harbour with the English fleet gathering for departure and the assembled throngs of courtiers queuing to board little boats ready to ferry their passengers to the waiting ships. The ships are decorated with celebratory banners and flags, and one has golden sails beneath which, standing on the deck, is the king himself. The second painting shows the astonishing spectacle of the event, with Henry again appearing centre stage at the head of a magnificent procession that weaves across the painting. There are hundreds of gold and painted tents all gathered around the temporary English palace that was built for the occasion. So these paintings, which Henry probably commissioned in the 1540s, looking back on the achievements of his reign, are glorifications of Tudor power and ambition. Henry's navy is celebrated in The Embarkation, and the palatial splendour of his campsite is the proud boast of the Field of Cloth of Gold. And these paintings are not just about a golden event, but they are themselves made from gold. So details of the tents are covered in gold leaf, prepared by gold beaters who prepared thin sheets that could be applied directly to the painting. Elsewhere, you find shell gold to add decorative highlights. And shell gold is made from paint with very small pieces of real gold added, normally from ground up gold leaf or waste gold left over from other artworks. Much of this is quite worn now, but the original paintings would have positively glittered under Tudor candlelight, probably as part of a programme of decoration designed for a particular court occasion, or as a permanent memorial to the authority of the Tudors. Yet these paintings are more than just colourful propaganda. They are also full of life. Ordinary men and women of all sorts and classes jostle along the harbour side, fire cannons to salute the departing fleet at Dover, man the rigging in the ships, queue up to get a glimpse of Henry's procession or the jousting tournament, cook for and wait upon the bespangled courtiers sitting down for elaborate banquets, beg for alms even around the fountains that really did flow with wine outside the temporary palace at the Field of Cloth of Gold. So this is the supporting cast of thousands who served in Henry's navy and built the Field of Cloth of Gold and attended and served there. And these are rare portraits, really, of some of those people that you don't expect to see commemorated visually in art from the 16th century.
And when you introduced the exhibition to us earlier, you were talking about that one of the themes is the Tudor connections with the wider world. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, as well as the Wolsey Rooms themselves, our new permanent Tudor World route has two further spaces where visitors will be able to explore what the rest of the world looked like in the 1500s. So how Europeans in particular, through their trade, but also through conquest and exploitation, widened their horizons, and how this impacted the lives of those in Asia, the Americas, and in Africa. These spaces will offer visitors the bigger picture, if you like. But we've also, throughout the new displays, found new ways of asking different questions and telling less familiar stories about well-known artworks. So to give you a couple of examples, looking again at the embarkation at Dover, you can't help but also be reminded of the fate of the Mary Rose, one of the grand warships almost certainly depicted here. And in 1545, the ship sank in the Solent off Portsmouth, with great loss of life, tragic catastrophe. As well as the lost lives, some very valuable military hardware, cannons and ammunition now lay on the seabed. So a salvage crew, led by a Venetian called Paolo Corsi, was contracted to recover them. Now, Corsi's team were a group of divers who had grown up in West Africa or one of the islands off that coast. And we know the names of at least one of these men, Jacques Francis, though that's almost certainly not his birth name. Jacques and his companions had learnt from an early age how to free dive in the pearl-rich shores of Africa. They developed lung capacity and physical strength that meant they could, as one witness described, abide underwater a long time as if they were mermaids, originally to harvest the pearls from the seabed near their coastline. But here they had this transferable skill as salvage operators, and the salvage was a success. Corsi's team used special equipment to haul the cannons and ammunition from the seabed after Jacques and the other divers had secured them with ropes. And Jacques and his colleagues are some of the first Black African lives we know a little about in Tudor England. And this is a small glimpse into a world that was becoming more aware of other cultures, of new ideas and technologies, of different faiths and ways of life. And another example that I wanted to give you for this is of how we deal with the wider world is the wonderful and mysterious full-length portrait by Marcus Geretz the Younger of an unknown woman in a Persian or Ottoman dress. Now, this is a full-length image of a young woman dressed in a beautiful, pale pink floor-length robe embroidered with colourful flowers, fruits, birds. She's also wearing an elaborate hat with a golden veil that flows down her back and blue jewelled shoes. She's rather mysteriously standing in a wood and rests her hand on the bowed head of a stag that stands peacefully beside her. Frustratingly, we know nothing certain about her identity. What we can say, though, is this dress is not typically English. It's based on Persian or more probably Turkish fashions, copied and created by English embroiderers. The Tudors loved to adopt foreign fashions. They wore imported fabrics like silk and velvet from Italy, furs from Russia, lace and linen from France and the Low Countries. and silks from as far afield as Eastern Asia. Their palaces were decorated with carpets from Anatolia and Egypt, tapestries from the Netherlands, and hangings and furnitures embellished with a type of design called arabesque, inspired by Muslim geometric patterns from Moorish Spain and North Africa. We also know that the Tudors sought contact through trade, but also because of political necessity, not just with other European states, but with the wider world. This was a world still full of hundreds of small communities with few settled national borders, but increasingly dominated by ambitious rulers who sought land, power, and dynastic immortality. And the Ottoman Empire in the 1500s stretched across Western Asia, Northern Africa, and Eastern Europe. In the later years of Elizabeth I's reign, when England had been cut off from Europe because of its religious rebellion against the Roman Catholic Church, England sought an alliance with the Ottoman Sultan against the threat of Catholic Spain. And what grew out of this was a warm personal correspondence of Elizabeth I herself with Safiye, consort of Sultan Murad II. They exchanged many gifts of jewellery and clothes, but they also discussed politics and trade. And this connection between the Muslim and Christian worlds in the 1500s extended beyond the court as merchants and diplomats travelled across the world, exchanged not just material goods, but new scientific discoveries and new ideas. So in some respects, the 1500s were a fertile century of exploration and discoveries, of sharing knowledge and trade. But of course, there was also a much darker side to this story. Exploration could easily turn to exploitation as more powerful nations found it easier not to engage in fair trade, but to conquer, colonize, and steal. Rich Europeans might have been able to enjoy new exotic foods and wear luxury fabrics from around the globe, but to monetize this demand, traders seized natural resources, enslaved local communities, destroyed precious local ecosystems and cultures. So, for example, European armies seized the lands of the Aztecs in Mexico and the Inca in Peru, looting vast amounts of gold, other precious metals, and emeralds. And of course, what all this leads to eventually is the shameful awfulness of the transatlantic slave trade in the following centuries.
Yeah, that's so important and so critical to look at those wider connections as well. And I'm also so pleased that you're focusing on the work of ordinary men and women, as you've mentioned a couple of times. So are you able to tell us about some of these people?
Well, the breadth of Tudor ambition and the depth of national rivalries across Europe meant that royal palaces became competitive expressions of wealth and magnificence. You had to flaunt your cultural sophistication in this brightly coloured world where luxury was not only fashionable but expected. So that kind of demand meant that you had armies of builders and labourers, artists and craftspeople labouring to produce imposing buildings, glorious decorative art, paintings, sculpture, tapestries, furnishings. Many foreign craftspeople found their way to England. Sculptors, goldsmiths, glassmakers, printmakers, painters, some invited for their expertise, others migrant workers. And one of the really enjoyable aspects of this project has been to be able to display from our own collections at historic royal palaces more everyday items and surviving fragments of these untold stories of some of the artists and craftspeople and also the other servants, these lost lives of the 1500s. So we have a Tudor tap, spice grater, glazed tile from Henry VIII's bath chamber, an ear scoop, set of keys, all hinting at the kind of everyday roles and occupations available at court. And also at the other end of the scale, we have a wonderful Tudor tapestry telling the story of the mythic Trojan hero Aeneas. And the weavers responsible for this were based in what's now Belgium, but are just one group of these small armies, these teams of artists working in and around the Tudor court, creating this astonishingly rich and colourful material culture and decorative interior world. And as I've said, artists were just one of many different trades that found opportunities for employment at royal palaces. Here at Hampton Court, up to 1,000 men and women lived and worked when the court was in residence, from high-ranking Tudor courtiers down to gong farmers who cleaned the toilets. You have to imagine the palace really as a small town, alive with intrigue and debate. Even children worked here as chimney sweeps, turnspits and tapestry beaters, while the king himself, where Henry VIII, was mostly surrounded by men, guards in charge of palace security, grooms, pages and personal attendants in charge of the private apartments, and Henry's wardrobe and his jewel house. And we even know the names of some of these people. One of the few women to have worked in Henry's private apartments was a lady called Anne Harris, who was responsible in the 1540s for cleaning and maintaining the king's personal napery and his undergarments and bandages. Anne was expected to provide as much sweet powder, sweet herbs and other sweet things as shall be necessary, suggesting that the odour was a significant issue, particularly Henry in his later years when he was suffering from these pus-filled wounds that would occasionally flare up in his legs. So the royal laundress was expected to have knowledge of all of these cleansing techniques and to pay for the appropriate ingredients out of her salary, these little minutiae of life that we discover by looking at the records more closely. And Anne did get a pay rise for all of this, you might be glad to hear, doubling her income in 1546 to £20 a year. But alongside all of these opportunities come difficulties and challenges, and navigating the shifting tides of Tudor politics in this violent age of change, getting on the wrong side of the king or queen, could mean ruin, imprisonment, or even death. Clearly, Henry VIII's rejection of the Roman Catholic Church and his subsequent pillaging and destruction of church property left this gaping spiritual hole as well in the centre of the ancient English communities. So old truths were suddenly questioned, and the charitable presence of monasteries and abbeys lost from the landscape. As William Shakespeare would later lament, there were now only bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sing. So some ordinary people were able to adapt to this and seize these new opportunities, but others faced very real crises of faith. And whilst the Tudor age left behind magnificent artworks and splendid palaces, it had also created these deep divisions in English society. For the next 200 years or more, religious divisions caused uncertainty for ordinary people, persecution, war and revolution. Some were able to adapt, as I've said, or even to take advantage of conflict and change, but others suffered or perished for their faith and beliefs.
It sounds like such a thought-provoking and rich exhibition. I think will absolutely provide opportunities for visitors to learn about so many different subjects and diverse people as well. So it sounds amazing. What are you hoping that visitors will take away from visiting this new exhibition?
Yeah, well, I as I said at the beginning, our ambitions are threefold. Really, firstly, to reopen the important interiors of the Wolsey Rooms to the public. Secondly, to redisplay these important Tudor history paintings alongside a range of other Royal Collection artworks and historic objects from our own collections and from other very generous lenders to historic royal palaces. But thirdly, finally, to give our visitors a wider picture of the Tudor world, both through the eyes of the ordinary men and women who worked at Hampton Court and for the Tudor dynasty, and toward a better understanding of Tudor England's interaction with the rest of the world and how this experience changed across the 1500s. And for me, it's been fascinating to look at a familiar past through other people's eyes, whether that's the lives of the ordinary people at court or the rest of the world looking back at Tudor England. This inspires new questions, new insights for me and for my colleagues, but also, I hope, for visitors that come to see the exhibition. Now, of course, we will always tell our headline story of Henry VIII and his queens at Hampton Court, and the Tudor state apartments here and the Tudor kitchens remain open as these wonderfully immersive experiences in their own right. But hopefully the Wolsey Rooms can widen our understanding a little further toward the fact that the 1500s were this time of great change and challenge for English people. And the Tudor dynasty that ruled England from 1485 until 1603 laid the foundations for the country's economic and political expansion and exploitation over the next 300 years. It's the beginning of a journey towards a colonial empire that would affect the lives of millions around the globe. So that part of it's a really important origin story that needs to be told.
Well, you sold it to me. I absolutely cannot wait to see it. And I recommend that anyone that can get to Hampton Court do so. And just to reiterate, this is a permanent exhibition, is that right? So we don't have a closing date?
No, it's open. It's become part of the main offer at Hampton Court. So it's available through your main ticket as you arrive, and it will be open permanently, which means for at least 10 years, we hope.
Oh, that's wonderful. Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast to talk Tudors with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On The Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.